You're looking at a photograph of Wilford Woodruff, the fourth president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and arguably the most important historian of its first century. Wilford Woodruff was a very good journal keeper. He kept journals from the time he joined the church in 1833 and continued keeping them up until his death in 1898. This is his very first journal, and it shows you how meticulous he was in his journal keeping. He would spend as much as an hour a day writing in his journal, and for very important events he would add a little bit of decoration. Here, for example, is the entry for his marriage date. As you can see here, he's decorated it with lots of filigrees and other things to make it look almost like a little marriage certificate by itself. At the end of his journal, he kept statistical accounts of what happened to him in a given year. Table for 1837, summarizing his life during that time period. It essentially tells how many meetings he had, how many miles he traveled, how many letters he wrote. It's a very meticulous statistical tabulation of the most important events that occurred in his life during that one-year time period. I blessed 2 children. I wrote 30 letters. I received 13 letters. Well, he kept up this kind of journal keeping his entire life in the church, from 1833 until 1898, a period of 65 years. And some of the entries are very poignant. He lived in the city of Nauvoo with the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith. He was there after Joseph Smith's death in 1844, and in 1846, the church completed the temple that was begun under Joseph Smith's direction before his death. This temple, to which he and other Latter-day Saints had devoted an enormous amount of time and money and effort, became a symbol for them of the great sacrifices that they had given. So when the people of Illinois drove out the Latter-day Saints in 1846, Wilford Woodruff made an entry in his journal, and he wrote, "I looked upon the temple and city of Nauvoo as I retired from it, and felt to ask the Lord to preserve it as a monument of the sacrifice of his saints." I think it's very poignant. He's getting his last glimpse of this building and asking God to protect it as a monument to his people's sacrifice. The importance of temples to Latter-day Saints is that they are the buildings in which they perform ceremonies that they believe will link families together for eternity. In most of today's world, when people marry, they believe that marriage is until death. Latter-day Saints value families highly and believe that they can be for eternity, and that temples are the places where the ceremonies are performed that make linkage together for eternity possible. So leaving a temple was leaving a place of great sacredness to Latter-day Saints. Now, in the case of Wilford Woodruff, he crossed Iowa, and then in 1847, the following year, he crossed the Great Plains of North America into the Great Basin and finally reached the Salt Lake Valley. When he reached the Salt Lake Valley, he was traveling with Brigham Young. And in his journal for that time period, he makes a note of the impression that he and Brigham Young had when they entered the Salt Lake Valley. He says, "President Young expressed his full satisfaction in the appearance of the valley as a resting place for the saints." They had been driven from place to place, and at last they thought here was a place where they could have freedom of religion and peace. Wilford Woodruff says here, "While we contemplated that in not many years that the house of God would essentially be built here in this valley in what they call the tops of the mountains." So having left their temple in Nauvoo, the moment they enter the Salt Lake Valley, they're already contemplating that in that valley will be built the Salt Lake Temple. Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff arrived in the Salt Lake Valley on July the 24th, 1847. And that was a Saturday. On Sunday, they paused to worship. On Monday, they climbed a nearby peak, and on that peak, they got a look at the valley and essentially declared this was the place they were going to be. And then Brigham Young went down into the valley between the two forks of a creek that flowed out of a nearby mountain, he put his cane into the ground and essentially said, "Here will be our new temple location." Wilford Woodruff was there on that occasion. He took a stake and he drove it into the ground to mark the place where Brigham Young said the temple would be built. In 1853, they finally began construction on that temple, and it took them 40 years to complete. In the meantime, the peculiar form of marriage practiced by Latter-day Saints, what common people call polygamy, but which Latter-day Saints call plural marriage, became an object of derision across the country. And in 1862, a federal law was passed prohibiting this kind of marriage. The Latter-day Saints ignored the law largely because it wasn't enforced and because they believed that the law was unconstitutional, that it violated their civil rights. Finally, 20 years later, the pressure to discontinue plural marriage increased with the passage of another law in 1882 and then an even tougher law in 1887. Combined with those laws were Supreme Court decisions essentially saying, no, these laws are constitutional. And so the Latter-day Saints, who during this period of time practiced plural marriage and believed in the importance of temples, were forced to a choice. And Wilford Woodruff talks about that choice in his journal. He essentially records a document that he released in September of 1890, beginning the ending of that practice of plural marriage. And this is the journal in which he recorded that. So under the date of September 25th, 1890, he recorded in red ink official declaration. And whenever he put anything in red ink, it meant it was a title, something very important. So official declaration, and then he copies into his journal a document that was released to the public and later called the Manifesto. This did not end plural marriage, but it started the ending of plural marriage in the church. And in this document, the operative language, the most important language, was this language down here that's in fine print, which basically says, "I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws," meaning the laws that had been passed and found constitutional, "and to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside to have them do likewise." That's the operative language. That's what began the end of the practice of plural marriage in the church. Now, as I mentioned, it didn't end immediately. People who had made marriage covenants with multiple women continued to support them, and they continued to live their lives, but the number of new marriages began to decline between then and a period of roughly 14 years until 1904, when there was a second manifesto issued. After that time period, they dropped off considerably. And now, of course, today, Latter-day Saints haven't practiced plural marriage for generations. And in fact, not only is polygamy prohibited in the church, but anybody found practicing polygamy is excommunicated from the church. That decision to choose the preservation of the temples, and that's really what drove this. Wilford Woodruff felt inspired to say that if things continued to go the way they were, the federal government would take over the church's temples and make it impossible for people to have the ceremonies that would join families together forever. So by issuing this manifesto, he and the members of the church were able to complete the Salt Lake Temple. And on April the 6th, 1892, when they finished the exterior, they had a ceremony in which they put the angel statue on the top over onto the capstone. And in his journal, Wilford Woodruff records that event. Under the date of April 6, 1892, he writes, "This was the most interesting day in some respects the church has ever seen since its organization. The temple capstone was laid with imposing ceremonies with electricity." By this time, electricity had reached the Salt Lake Valley, and so they dropped the angel onto its high pedestal using an electronic switch. "It was presided over," he writes in the third person, "by President Wilford Woodruff. It was judged there was 50,000 on the temple grounds." And so this was a huge public event, the largest public event in the history of Utah to that point. So a year later, April the 6th, 1893, they completed the temple and dedicated it. And from that time to the present, it's undergone a number of remodelings, but the exterior that you see in this 1892 photograph is essentially the exterior that you see today. This is a photograph of Wilford Woodruff and his wife. He was a man who had piercing eyes. All the photographs show eyes of a man who seemed to be able to look through people, but he was a very gentle man. In addition to being the fourth president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Wilford Woodruff really was, in many ways, its most important historian for that first century. He was the most important historian, I believe, because he experienced many of the most important events of the Church's history. From its early days and its persecutions in Missouri and Illinois, through crossing the plains with Brigham Young to Utah, to construction of the famed Salt Lake Temple. And he recorded these events in his journal, often spending a tremendous amount of time doing that. And it was this journal, this literary effort on his part, that causes us today to be able to plumb deep into these events, because we had someone there who was a witness who recorded his experience in a journal.